The 1980s was the best decade ever. Here's why. The 1980s absolutely ruled, and even when I take my rose-tinted Ray-Bans off, or my Wayfarers as we all wore at the time, it still, to me, represents, well, the peak of human ingenuity, creativity, and compassion. I'll come back to that in a minute. The decade is the likes of which I fear we won't see again. I mean, to be honest, the way things are going right now, I'll be lucky to see any new decade. God, I hope I'm wrong, but anyway, less said about that, the better. Go back to the 1980s. Let's take pop culture. Let's take music. I mean, we had Michael Jackson, we had Madonna, we had Prince, we had Whitney Houston, we had Queen. Okay, Queen started earlier, but to be fair, that was a big period for Freddie Mercury, was the 80s. And then what about movies? I mean, we had the Back to the Future trilogy. We had Ghostbusters, we had E.T., we had Terminator, we had Die Hard, Blade Runner, Star Wars. Okay, Star Wars started in the 70s, but, they also were into the 80s. We had Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a ton of other movies, and of course Star Trek, which was around since the 60s, but the two best Star Trek movies, The Wrath of Khan and The Voyage Home, are both from the 80s. And of course there's lots more. I mean, for example, The Simpsons cartoon debuted in the 1980s. What about computers? The way we live today, we owe it to the 80s. We got portable computers. Remember the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair Spectrum? I had a Sinclair Spectrum. The first mobile phones from Motorola, they also emerged in the 1980s, and the World Wide Web arrived in 1989. For gaming, how about Rubik's Cube, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and politics? Well, the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. And Band-Aid happened. That was the compassion I was talking about. What an amazing event that was. What about cars? Well, despite the 80s actually starting an economic recession, every single year of that mega decade has given us some epic autos. So many, in fact, that it's almost impossible to choose the top 10. I am going to attempt it, but I am going to shout out quite a few great cars in each of those years. Well, to 1980 then, and let's start with the W126 Mercedes S-Class. Now that was the definitive solid luxury saloon. You weren't anybody unless you had a 560 SEL. Personally, I lusted after the 560 SEC, the coupe version of that car. Now at the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about, and particularly because I lived in the Middle East, the Toyota Cressida. Absolutely rocked. It was a legend. Just everybody had one of those. There's the Renault 5 Turbo. That certainly hits all the right mental notes, doesn't it? However, the top of this podium must go to one car. I mean, there's just no question about this. It completely revolutionized the World Rally Championship, the WRC, and it introduced to us the concept of high-performance all-wheel drive cars. Of course, it's got to be the Audi Quattro. What an absolute legend. So the 1981 then, and the Isuzu Piazza, how about that car? Delightful little oddity, so beautiful, came out of nowhere, but it was designed by Giuseppe Giugiaro, so it was really pretty. And then you've got the rotary engine Mazda RX-7, that took America by storm, and the Japanese were on a bit of a roll, because we also had the Toyota Celica Supra, the A60. This one is particularly dear to my heart, because I had one, and I would have another one in a heartbeat. I just love that thing. And it was inspired by Lotus, I guess, but also worked on by Lotus, and that brings me to the Lotus Esprit. Now, admittedly, that was launched in the 70s, so I'm cheating a little bit, but the S3 Turbo, which to me kind of epitomizes the perfection of that original Giugiaro shape, was launched this year, so I was almost tempted to make that the car of 1981, but no, it's gotta be the DMC DeLorean, hasn't it? The gull-wing sports car was, okay, perhaps less than what it promised to be, but it became more than anyone could ever have imagined that it would be, thanks to a certain time-traveling adventure. Well, let's say it was in the Back to the Future. It was actually the third star of the Back to the Future series. 1982, well, great era for boy racers. Who doesn't remember the Ford Escort XR3i, especially in white, especially as a convertible? They were running all over London at the time. Then there was the Mitsubishi Starion, the sort of infamously misnamed car, because I think it was meant to be the Stallion. Then you had the Porsche 944. And what about that sharp-suited Swede, the Volvo 700 series? Not the sportiest of things, but utterly solid and reliable. Mercedes came out with its first small saloon, the W201 190 series. series. Now, this thing really existed only to give the BMW E30 a run for its money, especially in 2.316 guys, which was designed to take on the E30 M3. But it was never going to usurp the BMW, that's for sure. That E30 is a legend, and particularly to me, I have a lot of affection for the E30. I had a 325i SE. I totally miss it. I'd have another one in a heartbeat. However, 1982, it's got to be the year of Knight Rider. It's got to be the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, particularly in black, particularly a T-top, because who doesn't want kit, right? Who doesn't want a talking car? All of us that watched that show in the 80s, for us, it's got to be that car. 1983 then, and I almost gave this year to the Honda CRX. Again, another car that I owned, and one of the top three, and two of which I've already mentioned, that I really miss and I would have again in a heartbeat. The Peugeot 205 is definitely worthy of a mention here. And what about the lust-worthy shark-nosed BMW 635 CSI? I so wanted one, particularly the M635 CSI. Reviewed one of those a couple of years ago on this channel. But it's got to be the Drift King, the Toyota AE86, based on the humble Corolla hatchback. That car launched 1 million cars sideways since, and it was of course immortalized in the Japanese street racing manga series Initial D, both the book and the cartoon. And of course it sired the current GT models, the GT86 or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it is a legend. It's basically the godfather of drifting, so we've got to give it to that car. 1984, and how about the Ford RS200? No, it was something of a premature legend. It was gone before its time really came. But we've also got to give respect to the tough old Jeep Cherokee, the XJ model, because you still see them running around today. Meanwhile, Toyota basically came up with a poor man's Ferrari, the highly acclaimed MR2, which led to a series of 3 of them. And as for Ferrari itself, oh my God, were they on a roll. First of all, the fist-bitingly gorgeous 288 GTO. I adore that thing, and of course it was the predecessor of the F40, but just to outdo itself, Ferrari then gave us the car that frankly epitomizes the 80s, with its outlandish slats on the side, its 2 wide shoulder pads, and of course big red hair. And by red hair I mean of course the engine block. It has to be the Testarossa, famously driven by Don Johnson in Miami Vice. I mean, you just don't get more 1980s than a white Ferrari Testarossa. It's got to be that one. Absolutely awesome. So to the middle of the decade then, 1985, and I tell you what, Ferrari could have taken this year as well, because they launched the amazing 328, which of course was the follow-up to the 308, the car that Magnum drove. I love that car. To me, it says Ferrari. I would have that in a heartbeat. But I also love Honda. And Honda introduced its first luxury car this year, literally called The Legend, which was well ahead of its time. Everybody was taken aback by that one. And then you had the Bentley Turbo R. That's awesome. BMW's inaugural M5 based on the E28 5 Series. But the 80s was about being daring, about being unique, and a little crazy and out there, let's be honest. Things like asymmetric steering wheel with 2 spokes at 90 degrees to each other. That's so very 80s. And where was that? Well, that was found on the bizarre but brilliant XT Coupe from Subaru. I'm going to give it to this car because it just looks like nothing else. And so we come to the second half of this amazing decade, and the good cars just don't stop coming. In fact, 1986 was a bit of a banner year for great cars. We had the desert-conquering Lamborghini LM002, their original off-roading SUV. What a beast that was. And talking of beasts, we had the Mercedes-AMG Hammer, which was an E-Class with a 5.6-litre V8. We had the A70s Toyota Supra, which was beautiful. And then Honda's best-looking Honda Accord to date, which was the Aerodeck with the pop-up headlights. I mean, where did that even come from? Then we had every bank robber's wet dream, the Ford Sierra RS Cosworth. So many of these were nicked. Nobody could afford to have them because nobody could afford to insure them. On the other hand, there was the automotive feast of high-tech engineering and innovation that was the Porsche 959. There was simply nothing else like it at the time, and it set a really high standard, a really high bar for supercars to follow. And of course, a lot of the engineering from that car fed into 911s for generations after that, and certainly inspires the car even today. 1987, and I'll tell you straight up front, it's got to be the year of the Ferrari F40, one of the greatest Ferraris ever. This was basically Ferrari's riposte to that complex Porsche 959, but this one, as technically sophisticated and as clever as that one, this was as raw as you could imagine. It was just about the purest of road races. The iconic F40 was, of course, also the last car that was signed off by Enzo Ferrari himself, so it's absolutely legendary. But I will give a shout out to some other cars also in this year. For example, the dramatic Alfa Romeo 164. When did saloons get that sexy? The BMW E34 5 Series, the world's best executive car, and the low and lean Honda Prelude with the four-wheel steering. I've got a video of that on this channel as well. That was awesome. Then there was the badass Buick Grand National GNX with a bit of a surprise, and of course Vanilla Ice's favorite ride, the restyled Ford Mustang 5.0. 1988 was the year that saloons got serious. We got the Peugeot 405 Mi16. What a thing that was. Not to be outdone, Japan's Mitsubishi gave us the Galant VR4, which essentially was a precursor to the legendary Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. And on the other side of the Atlantic, there was the Ford Taurus SHO. We also got the long-running Suzuki Vitara, which proved that a compact SUV could go anywhere and, in fact, wear any badge, because the Vitara was licensed and marketed under multiple brands. You really would be surprised. However, the remarkable little BMW Z1 Roadster was not just cute and quick, thanks to a straight 6 out of a 325i, the same one that I had in my old car, and it had lightweight plastic panels which could be removed and whatever you, but also it had doors that would sink down into the sills. How cool was that? These are great investment right now, and this is the car of 1988. And so we come to the last year of this incredible decade, and it was as if the 1980s was like, I'm not done yet, I've got more to give. What a year 1989 was. The car makers were trying to squeeze out the last of the automotive brilliance of this sensational decade. And literally, there was a whole lineup of amazing cars that came our way. Here's just a few of them. I'll have to take a deep breath for this, but you had the bonkers Alfa Romeo SZ. What a crazy thing that was. The slinky BMW E32 8 Series, the sharp edge out of space Citroen XM, the go anywhere Land Rover Discovery, and Lexus, of course, completely took the standard for luxury cars to a whole new level with their Lexus LS Luxo barge. And of course, then you had the California conquering Mercedes SL, the R129 Roadster, and then not one, not two, but three Nissan superstars, the 240SX, the 300ZX, the Z32 version, and Godzilla himself, the R32 GTR, arguably probably the best in that series. Lotus, not to be outdone, gave us its modern version of the Elan Roadster, which was pretty much the best handling front-wheel drive car ever to that point. But Mazda were looking at the original Elan. They gave us a car that encapsulated the feel-good factor of the decade, and it's perfectly executed homage to that original Elan. Of course, the MX-5 Miata Roadster. Quite simply, it was an affordable, delightful, and hugely fun car to drive. And of course, it went on to become, till now, the world's best-selling two-seater convertible. It has to be the car of 1989 in a decade where we just had some unbelievably sensational, memorable, and now collectible cars. So what do you think? Prove me wrong. Do you think that was not the best decade? Do you think there was another decade? Well, tell me in the comments below. And you know what? Maybe I'll do a video about some of those other decades as well. Let me know if you want me to do that. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.
A big shout out and thanks to Jay Williams over at AirTechnic, who are top tier sponsors of Brown Car Guy. Check them out at AirTechnic Co. UK for exhausts, brakes, suspension and body kits. Plus our other major sponsor, Nayagen Solutions. Much appreciation also to tier 4 sponsors, Muhammad Ali Humaid, Tom Conway Gordon and Reza Adil. And of course all these other guys who supporting on Patreon. Brown Car Guy is eternally grateful. Hey, think about joining them over at patreon.com Brown Car Guy. If you can't, don't worry. Just make sure you're subscribing to the YouTube channel and website. Plus follow on social media by searching for Brown Car Guy.